Also warm welcome from my side. I think just to start off, allow me one comment that I think although there is technically no gender dedicated work package in Fatigue, us being here today, having this panel kind of speaks to one thing that I think our projects will hopefully demonstrate, that if we want to understand populism and illiberalism and all the developments that we see in Central Eastern Europe, we cannot do that without taking a gender lens as well. And I think also the broad variety of our projects today kind of shows this quite nicely. I will share today some first insights from my research on civil society and political parties and gender mobilization in Krakow. I will just touch briefly on some of the key concepts, I guess, for the Fatigue ESRs. This might not all be that new, but I kind of want to make some point why gender matters for the Polish example, using the Polish example as well, and then kind of speak a bit about my theoretical framework and the relational approach that I use for this before going to speak a bit more about the actors mobilized around gender in Krakow itself. So the two key concepts that kind of underpin this project and also my research interests are, for one, illiberalism and populism. Illiberalism here understood as a regime type, kind of distinguishing itself from liberal democracy that's marked by the protection for minority rights and the rule of law. And populism here understood in Kasmuda's ideational approach as a thin ideology with the corrupt elites pitched against pure people, and politics following the logic of will of the people. And as you see in the slide, they kind of intersect in the sense that this exaltation of the will of the people, this volonté générale, kind of justifies why substance goes over procedures, and that means that the rule of law and liberal democratic procedures can be overruled if it serves this alleged will of the people. And the problem also why this kind of fuels illiberalism is that this kind of targets the rule of law and also minority rights in particular. Gender matters in both of these aspects. Using the Polish example, I think we've seen quite well with the latest ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland just last month, that if the rule of law is no longer secured and a court like the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland can be used, to actually seriously curtail women's rights in an issue that where the democratic procedure through parliament has not been successful. I think there is a danger that similar tactics can be used also to target sexual minorities. So currently there is an initiative led by civil society organizations, but nevertheless that will also be heard in parliament to stop pride marches in Poland. So I think that could be potentially also a danger here. And populism, although Kasmuda himself actually says that there is no gender component to it, I think if we think about the pure people, the question of reproduction comes up quite quickly. So even in this thin bit, that's already kind of inherent, but also there's a very gendered definition of the pure people, the pure Polish people in our case, and the corrupt elites. So feminists and queer people are kind of perceived and drawn out to be foreign, un-Polish, a threat to the nation, whereas kind of this idea of a pure people describes very strict conservative gender roles to women, focusing on their role as mothers, as bearers of the nation, and also the ones who have to make sacrifices for their nation. I think this following image kind of captures a lot of these things that are happening in Poland right now. So this is a call for action by Amnesty International to drop the charges against 3 Polish activists who had the audacity to Photoshop the Black Madonna from Częstochowa, this Polish pilgrimage, with a halo rainbow. So I think it really captures a lot of these essential conflicts that we have right now. So you have a strong role of Catholic values, you have the Queen Mary, Mary, there are even attempts to make her, the Polish queen, or kind of announce her to be Queen of Poland, but also how this is pitched against queer rights, and also how it's actually an offense to hurt religious feelings if you publicize such an image. My interest to kind of understand how this is all happening relies for that, I zoom into one particular field of mobilization. And as we've already seen, I think with the image quite well, the gender stretches across the ideological and civil society field. So it is a very broad issue, and that's the one that I decided to zoom in to understand this. For this, I think it's important to understand civil society not in a Tocquevillian, Putnam optimistic perception tradition where civil society is basically, a school for democratic citizens, and then they can go out and behave democratically in their liberal democracy, but rather following this idea that Huntington put out, but also Berman, or in her work on civil society in the Weimar Republic, showcased that there's also a dangerous aspect to civil society once it becomes illiberal. And this is where I rely on Grzegorz Eckert, who uses this concept of pillarization, stressing the role of of this dark side of civil society, how he calls it, which would be an illiberal bit of civil society. That is kind of fueling, on the one side, this illiberal turn as it hides potential for social conflict, contentious mobilization, and instability. But also, once these illiberal political corresponding forces in the political sphere come into power, they can also shift, for instance, resources towards these actors and make sure that they have a much more kind of, friendly environment to themselves. In this, I already kind of highlight that there are these different compartments in civil society, but then I wanted to focus on the relationships that they have towards political parties as well. And for this, I rely on a relational approach. So following Mario Diani's work on Cement of Civil Society, I distinguish between two types of ties that can exist. One is kind of material cooperation, sharing information, sharing events, co-organizing events, sharing resources. And on the other hand, what Diani would call boundary definition, which is more kind of value sharing process. And based on these various different modes of coordination and ties, we can kind of try to understand better the role of these different groups and their contribution to the development of democracy, but also how they themselves develop. So although I'm in the political work package and I'm trying to tie this all back to political parties, the approach I take actually departs from civil society. For this, as Richard already mentioned, I got to spend, the academic year in Krakow. If it wasn't for COVID, that would have been more or less a year. I chose Krakow also because there we have a very local civil society. Not only, there are also ties to other organizations in Poland, but it's not as it would be in Warsaw, for instance, where a lot of the national organizations are registered in Warsaw because it's the capital, although they're active all over the place. It is in a rather peace-leaning area, so it's much more conservative. The president of the parliament of the region is actually the father of the current president. And based on these two different types of ties, I then went out to do a survey with civil society organizations mobilized around gender issues in Poland. For this, I departed from not just formalized and registered groups, although they were definitely an essential part. And then compiled this list, kind of checked it also with events, who's co-organizing them to make sure that I have a comprehensive one. I ran this past activists and then sent it out this summer. So now I'm going to present my kind of first insights. The survey is actually still running, especially over the last weeks in Poland. Groups organized, mobilized around gender issues have been very busy on the streets. But nevertheless, I'm kind of, will hope I can share some bits. As a disclaimer, I got a much higher return rate from LGBTQ activists, also more than from feminist activists. But yeah, I will come back to that in a bit, but it was potentially more left-leaning, the results that I received at the moment. What I found interesting is that there's a tendency by activists to describe themselves as apolitical. And this is even if there's awareness that some of their aims or potential demands are much more in line with certain political parties. So one activist actually filled in the survey and said, well, we want to stay out of politics, but if we look at our our agenda, we have to admit that we're kind of in line with the left-wing parties. So to have a look at the civil society ties, there were, most of them actually cooperated with other groups in Krakow, and some of them with groups in Krakow and in, say, Warsaw and other places. So that kind of gave me confirmation that although we are in such an connected and global spanning society these days, that the local component is still a good entry point. I found more identity sharing ties. So I would put this down to awareness and support for other groups that are there, but that does not necessarily lead to cooperation. What was inherent though was that there were low connections to political parties. There were, the favorite ones were Lewica Razem, Wiosna, which is also left-leaning, and the former Communist Party, SLD, or their successor party, let's put it that way. But nevertheless, there was not strong cooperation with them, and also in terms of value sharing, I think there was a certain reluctance to identify political partners. I did get also feedback from Catholic organizations, and they've been the most adamant to highlight that they are apolitical, not naming any political party that they would share values with. So I found that was quite interesting, although they've definitely been more difficult to track down, these groups, and that will be something that has to be elaborated in further research, I think. Although some of the right-wing parties were not that involved, there was still some, in terms of attending events, where even Porozumienie, which is like the junior partner to the Peace Party, were involved in these groups. So it's not completely separated from this small insight already that we would see. Half of the organizations actually stated that they don't think that politicians are useful to achieve their goals. And the biggest other share was then saying that national politicians are useful. There's only one organization that actually identified local politicians to be the most useful, and there were even, well, more of them who would say that European politicians are useful for their goals. So I think there is quite something to unpack that has to be, especially then later in interviews, kind of to develop a bit more. What I found was a growing formalization, especially of LGBTQ activism. That can be kind of seen in the registration numbers of actual organizations working in Krakow on this, but it's also in the sense that it's a very strong network between these groups, and some of them do very professional work. So currently, for instance, there's a survey being conducted in Krakowian high schools, where they try to figure out the experience of queer young people in Krakow, advocating then for anti-discrimination guidelines for these schools. So they're working very professionalized, and one big role also played here was the campaign against homophobia, which is a Warsaw-based organization and one of the oldest LGBTQ organizations in Poland. So although we have a growing local field, there's also this tying back with other groups and outside there. And I think there is Conor Dwyer in his book coming out of Communism highlights that in times of severe backlash, the queer movement in Poland under the first peace government in 2005 to 2007 actually became much stronger, much more organized. And I guess that could be an indication that in the case of Krakow, we see something similar right now as well. And I think, yeah, backlash in Poland is quite obvious, so that doesn't really have to, well, I mean, that's observable already. Yeah, so this is just the first insight. So especially as I'm still interested in the connection towards political parties, and right now there's not that apparent there are no strong apparent ties. I'm also very interested in getting your feedback in terms of, you know, how should I take this further? What should I pay particular attention to when I go into my interviews? And I am afraid that I rushed through this quite quickly, so apologize for the speed, but thanks for bearing with me.